Hi, Dallas Symphony Chorus friends. This is Josh coming to you again from my living room. It's April the 6th, 2020, and this past weekend would have been our performances of the Schmidt Book of Seven Seals. And of course, I've been thinking of you so much and sad not to have shared those experiences with you, as well as what would have been tonight's first Berlioz Romeo and Juliet a rehearsal. But we're looking for ways to keep music in our lives and to keep excited about the future. And so I'm here to talk today about the third movement in our Verdi series. We're looking at the Verdi Requiem. And I said the third movement, it really should be the third and fourth, Offertory and then the Sanctus, is what we're going to talk about today. And the Offertory is, even for those choristers who know the Verdi Requiem really well, somewhat less familiar because there's no chorus in it. It's written for the quartet of soloists and the orchestra. So let's look at the ideas that make it a really beautiful movement, and then we'll compare and contrast that to a little bit of the Sanctus, which you choir singers probably know pretty well, and that'll be our talk for today. So let's look at the first opening idea in the Offertory. It begins in the cellos, and they have a solo section, and it's really all the way from the bottom of the instrument to the top, 4.5 octaves. It sounds like this. And then strings and winds. This is a really beautiful musical idea and tricky to play well. So the cellos always have to rehearse that quite a bit when we do this piece. And then that's followed eventually by the main melody, which is going to be introduced again in the cellos, playing in a relatively high register. Sounds like this. And then tenor and mezzo soloists, do, mi, they comment a little bit on it. The next soloist to enter is the bass soloist, and he has that same main tune on the text Libera Animas. And then mezzo and tenor comment similarly on that. And that's our basic idea to start. It goes down in register when we get to the words profundo lacu. That's typical. It means deep pit. Let me not fall into the deep pit or deep hole. And composers going all the way back to Mozart and before have been inspired by that to write in a low register. So no surprise, Verdi does the same thing there. Then measure 62. The soprano soloist has been silent up to this point, and she enters on a high E. It comes in, I'll give you a little context here. Bass about 4 bars before, 58 is playing. And there's that E. Out of nowhere she sings sed. It's the beginning of sed signifer, be a light, be a shining symbol for us, or protection for us, Saint Michael. And all of a sudden that E takes us from C major to a totally remote key of E major and really A major. There's a beautiful side slip here as we move down a half step. And we're back in A flat major, which is exactly where we started. So that's one of those great moments. It's a violin duet, 2 players playing in that high E major sound. I'll play it for you again so you can get a feel for how beautiful that moment is. Sorry. Now here's your side slip. Sorry. Play it again. A flat major. So we're back home in the original key. And those are just some great examples of Verdi's harmonic ingenuity, his way of wrapping beautiful tunes around beautiful harmonies that are so important in this Requiem. So that goes for a while until we get to Quam olim Abrahe. And in this text, which talks about Abraham and his generations forever, those that would follow him, because there's a historical reference here. It's very common for composers to be inspired to write something quote-unquote historical, which is to say a fugue, or at least something that's imitative. Verdi doesn't go all the way to fugue in the same way that previous composers have, but he does give us a little bit of imitation. There's a 2-bar phrase, it's introduced by the bass, and then the tenor takes it up, mezzo, soprano. Similar idea. So there's an imitative section here when it talks about something that is a promise for all generations. A promise implies a bond between the voices. And so they respond with close imitation, but not a fugue. We'll be talking about fugues in just a second. And then there's a great chromatic descending line. Soprano has it first, and she sings Qua moli m'abrahe. One of those great dramatic operatic gestures. The tenor has the same, and then everybody has it. What's fascinating with what Verdi does is as he harmonizes it 3 times, he changes the harmony. But just as interestingly, he changes the rhythmic figure of the accompaniment. So at first it's just quarter notes, ba-da-dee-dee-dee-dee-dee, all harmonized. The next time the tenor does it, it has syncopated strings, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba, all jumping one on top of the other. And then the third one, which has everybody, is triplets. So that's an example of Verdi, the melody and theme and variations composer. And we're going to see more of that because it is a natural way for him to work, developing these melodies and changing them while keeping them still familiar. This all leads us, surprisingly, because we've been in A-flat major, all the way through a couple of jarring key changes to C major. And there's a beautiful moment where the first violins here are playing harmonics, and then there's a tremolo in the upper strings. Pianissimo. And we get a tenor melody. I'll sing at the low octave. This is a typical Verdian melody. Absolutely seems inevitable, a natural, beautiful, simple melody, but somehow incredibly inventive. We know here that he's referencing a religious style. And we know this because in his operas, in Falstaff, for example, or in Aida, whenever there's a character who is in prayer, there's a similar melody to this. One that moves stepwise, gently, with very calm accompaniment, often tremolo in the strings. This kind of a figure. So this is a very common Verdian technique and incredibly beautiful in this moment for the tenor, who of course will sing it up the octave, and it's that much more impressive. As Verdi will do again in the Agnus Dei and has done before, he takes this great tune and develops it and does a theme and variations kind of development through it. There's a minor mode version that's quite beautiful here. The soprano sings Fa, che est Domine, Fa, che est Domine. And then all the other soloists come with her. And here we're back in C major. And you recognize that tune. That's the Ostias again in major. And here the soloists have this wonderful, it's called sottovoce parlando. Sottovoce quietly, parlando speaking, almost as if they're muttering a prayer. Facias, Domini facias, Dome facias, Deo facias. All the while, above them is that same tune with just a little accented dissonance coming in the winds. This is a beautiful moment, and this parlando, which we saw also in the first movement, we're going to see in the last movement, in the Liberame, that's going to come back, and that's how the entire piece ends, with that soprano, low kind of prayer chanting. The return of the Quamoli Mabrahe text, which is part of the Requiem text, it happens twice, invites the same music to come back, and of course it's the same music, but it leads us to a slightly different place, whereas before it led us into the Ostias, Quamoli Mabrahe and Ostias. Here, it leads us back to A flat major, which is where we started, with this great tune returning. And Verdi chooses to bring back this tune. It is not required that this text come back. The Quamoli Mabrahe does come back, but Verdi then picks up the text from the original part of the movement and drops it here to finish it out musically. And it's the same tune as before. And it gets quieter. Until the soprano has this beautiful arpeggio. And she sings, Faceas de morte transire ad vitam, let them be taken from death into life, and so she ascends from the bottom to the top. And of course, if you're listening carefully, you recognize that original in what she does here. Beautiful high A flat, and we finish out. That's our offertory. Now, let's look at the Sanctus. Unlike others' majestic settings of this movement, which so often are broad and majestic, here Verdi has done something completely different. His idea is exuberant. It's exciting. There's a fanfare at the beginning, brass trumpets, and we sing one Sanctus, then two Sanctuses, and then three Sanctuses. And it's almost as if we're raising the curtain at the theater. We have a feeling like an overture, something is about to begin. And then we launch into a fugue, and not just any fugue, but a double fugue. So let's talk about what a fugue is and what the basic concepts are. A fugue is an imitative process by which music is worked out and shared between voices. The voices can be actually vocal voices. They can be the voices of the instruments as well. Most often those two double each other in a fugue. And usually there's a subject, which is the main idea that is tossed around, a counter subject, which is a contrasting idea that is also used in imitation. And then there are moments of what's called episodes where that fugue subject or counter subject is likely to be absent, and we have other music. That's actually not the case in this double fugue that Verdi wrote for us, but in a typical fugue it would be the case, where the subject goes away for a while, and it is a modulatory section, which means typically we're moving through keys more quickly, and then the original subject comes back, most often in the original key, and we have that sense of completion. In addition, there are fugal techniques that are often used. One would be augmentation. The idea of taking a tune, and let's just say that our fugue subject is row, row, row your boat. If you had that in augmentation, you might have all the notes twice as long. And once you get longer and longer, you begin to no longer recognize the tune. Etc., etc. You get the idea. Augmentation. You also might take a theme and invert it. So instead of row, row, row your boat, you might sing the same intervals but moving in a different direction. Some composers were turned to stretto, S-T-R-E-T-T-O, stretto, which is a technique in which instead of waiting for one voice to finish its theme before beginning its own, each voice interrupts the next. And so we have instead of, and then the next one, you might have ro, ro, and the next one enters early. That's something that is also often used called stretto. So let's see what happens here. Verdi sets us up with the fugue subject. And instead of having a single fugue in which this subject and counter subject plays out, he's got a double fugue, which means he's going to have two different choirs, each with its own four-voice fugue playing out against an independent orchestra, which is an additional voice. So let's look at the ideas. Main subject is in soprano 1. Here's the main subject, Sanctus. Of that, we can break it down into the subject. And then its counter subject. That is introduced in each voice in turn. So as the subject goes, soprano, here at that moment, the alto enters. Same theme. Slightly varied, because very often when composers are working on harmonies, they'll invert a subject or they'll change an interval here or two as they do. And then the alto has a similar counter subject. And so it goes in choir 1, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. Each one has their own turn. While this is going on, there's an entirely separate four-voice fugue happening in choir 2 with its own subject, its own counter subject, and it sounds like this in the soprano group. Sorry, let me do that one again. And then a little small counter subject. This, in turn, is passed between all the choir 2 voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. The fascinating thing that Verdi does is he overlaps them. So while choir 1 has soprano starting, then alto, then tenor, and bass, in between each of those entrances, soprano in choir 2 begins, so that they're offset, and the entrances are really soprano 1, soprano 2, different subject, alto 1, the original subject, alto 2, the second subject, and you get the idea. It all plays out in this really intricate web of counterpoint. This goes for a long time, and we get, as expected, in the middle, a modulatory section, which means that we're moving between keys. So at the beginning, almost everything is in F, and we move to C, and then back to F. That's all very stable. But then in the middle, we start to move around, and more quickly, we begin to move through different key areas and key centers using little fragments of the tune, Benedictus qui venit in nomine Domine. Sometimes we have Osane in excelsis, but it's always these same themes going back and forth in 8 voices, plus the voices of the orchestra, which are largely independent. That all goes until this beautiful middle section, Pleni sunt cieli et terra. And listen to this. Here's the first choir. Does that ring any bells? Do you remember the original tune? The original tune was... If we take just that much and we think about this second tune, do you hear the relationship? Really, this is just the first tune in augmentation. lengthened note values, complete with the same accents on the offbeats. Let me just play the original tune, starting in the second bar. And now that second tune, Pleni Suncelli. Almost the same notes. And so what we've got here is an augmentation, harmonized in 4 parts, and then choir 2 hops in with Osana. All the while the orchestra is playing are arpeggios mostly, a couple scale passages, but then mostly arpeggios, reminding us of the first bar of the original idea, which is an arpeggioed major scale. So this goes for a while, until finally Verdi thinks, well, what am I going to do to bring this whole thing to a close? And he adds a chromatic line. And this chromatic line starts in the orchestra, and it goes up half steps wildly. It happens again, more instruments join in, all the while the choir is singing big block chords. And it's a very exciting ending, and you think, well, what more could he possibly do? He adds syncopation at the end. If you know that this part about 1, 2, 3, 4, about 10 bars from the end, where there's this great offbeat, etc., as they're jumping around, and we feel that excitement growing until we all have, let me see, and here, most editions leave out the fermata. But I believe the editors who say, no, there should be a fermata here because it is the most exciting moment in the whole thing as the timpani is playing a role. And so he has... And that's Verdi's Sanctus. A big overview. One of the really fun movements to sing if you're a choral singer. So when we come back to this next week, I'm excited to be talking about the Agnus Dei, which is the next movement that follows this, and we'll talk about the Lux Aeterna. And then the following movement will be for the following week, Libera Me, which is the one that we'll be singing for not only the October performances complete of the Verdi Requiem, obviously, but we'll reprise it in March of 2021 for the American Choral Directors Association meeting. And we'll be talking about that more in weeks to come. Until we meet again, keep music in your life. Keep singing how you can. You might think about Charlotte's canon that she wrote for us, her quarantine canon. My family has started rehearsing that, and we're having a great time with it. And then, of course, by all means, stay healthy, stay safe, and I can't wait to see you on the other side when we get to join together and sing once more again. Until then, be well and take care.